Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of JDM Masters, and today it's a start of a new series where we're going to explore and review tuned cars. And today we have also Dustin with us.
Hey guys.
As you can see from the last video where we were talking about how we want to do special versions of different cars.
Right, a series on tuned cars.
Yeah.
And as promised, I'm here.
I think going forward, we're going to take a look at some more tuned cars as well. And when we do that, the point of that is not necessarily to talk about the modifications that are done to the car and how awesome they are, but just to kind of show you these JDM parts and how they've kind of laid the foundation, so to speak.
Absolutely right.
For like the modern tuning companies.
Yes.
And we have a pretty interesting car for you guys, so let's check it out.
So today we have here a Nissan Skyline GT-R R32. It's a 1992. And so this makes it a later version. So as you guys know, the Skyline GT-R is a very popular tuning base for many reasons. So let's go through some of the specs of the factory car first. Now, it has a RB26 2.6 liter twin turbo from the factory. Now a little bit about the origins of this. So the R32 was the first modern GT-R to have the GT-R badge again. And so back when Nissan was racing in Group A, they used the 31, which had an RB20, and for various reasons they decided to upgrade it to a 2.6 with a new engine and put four-wheel drive. So this really was, back in 1989, and that technology with the four-wheel drive Atessa system and the compact body with the twin turbo ceramic, it was a fantastic base, and it was high-tech, and a lot of cars in that age just couldn't match up to it. But also, it created a very good tuning base for the reason that it was already a detuned version for the street for Group A racing. Now, the R32 found a lot of fame, just like it's the first GT-R, the Hakosuka, winning a lot of Group A races, mainly in Japan, but also some in Australia, as we've explained in our video on the Nissan Heritage, as you can see over here. The R32 series of Skyline was based on the 32 rear-wheel drive, but for the GT-R, a lot of different changes to it. So let's go through them. First of all, the body width was widened on the front and the rear to increase the track. And bonnet is aluminum, the fenders are aluminum, aerodynamics are made and homologated specifically for Group A racing. Now the Nismo Group A racing car had a 500 or 600 horsepower fully tuned engine. The street version, of course, had a lot of racing parts derived from that. And so Nissan really put a lot of effort into the engineering of the engine, but because of these changes and improvements, it became a really good tuning base for the car. The R32 Skyline's iconic rear round tail lights, and on the 32 compared to the later versions of the 33 and the 34, it's very low and very streamlined. Because it's an 80s design with the next generation 90s design, you can see here on the rear how the bumpers are cut a little bit. You have the tow hooks a little bit exposed, which is quite normal on 80s cars, but it has the 90s flair on the top part, and these indented Skyline words, something I really like a lot. And this is what's important, the GT-R. A little small note, for the 32 GT-R, the inside bit of the word here is actually color coded. So if the body was white, this was white. If you had other colors, black or gunmetal, all of these were separate different pieces. So looking now at the R35, as you can see, all the letters, the GT, there is nothing inside. It's just reflecting on the bare body. And so for the stock wing, the angle is really high on the rear part, of course, to increase maximum downforce. Now, because of the Group A racing regulations, a lot of the design of this part had to be within certain dimensions, and so therefore it wasn't all crazy huge. But for the later evolution, Nismo version is, you see this addition here is from the Nismo road car, which was also homologated to give even more downforce by putting a secondary sort of wing on the inside. And it's very popular with many R32 GT-R owners to fit these parts. Most of the body has been left pretty much stock, and it looks a lot just like a normal road car. So it's really difficult to tell that it's a tuned car unless you look at certain small things. Let's have a look. So here the body looks completely normal, but where you can tell it's very different from a 100% stock road car are the brake rotors. Now these are Brembo, but the original 1989 GT-R didn't have Brembos. They were Sumitomo, and it has Nissan on it. Later versions, V-Spec, adopted a Brembo system, and it was also used into the 33 and to the 34, and also the Z33 Fair Lady Z. So that's one key thing. The car passes by, you can tell, this is not really normal. There's a reason for this. Admittingly, GT-Rs would not be so famous for their handling if it wasn't for this one special component. It's the complicated but very high-tech four-wheel drive system which Nissan calls the Atessa. So you have the gearbox mounted in a FR style, and there's another prop shaft coming out to the front, sending drive towards the front wheels. So most of the time, the Atessa makes the car in rear-wheel drive mode. When it's accelerating, it shifts some torque a little bit to the front, and depending on the cornering with various different G sensors, and even has four-wheel steering, it allows the car to corner very, very smoothly, reducing understeer, which is a very important thing in the Group A racing, because the Group A car had a lot more power with an increased capacity, so the Atessa four-wheel drive really helped it in its cornering. Now on the road car, this means that you could put a lot more power to a relatively small and light chassis, and you know, back in the early 90s, the only other car that was fully four-wheel drive was the Lancer Evolution 123 series, and still even this had understeer problems. That was a full-time, but being a part-time system, it allowed it a lot more flexibility for grip, especially on the circuit. Now let's have a look a little bit at the interior. The R32 is a mix of 80s and 90s thinking. Old school 80s style, high-tech, but also quite functional. Now the only stalk I see on the steering column is the indicator stalk. Where do you control the headlights? It's actually right here. So you have these little dials for the fog lamps. The rear demister are buttons located in one piece on the instrument cluster. On the other side, you got the hazard light, and also two buttons to control the stock radio, and the wipers are controlled here. Now, driving this car for the first time, it took a little bit of time to get used to the controls, but it's very intuitive and also something very high-tech. For the next version, they simplified it, went back to the normal ones. And let's have a look inside here. The normal BNR 32 shows 180 on the speedometer, which is limited by regulation from the Japanese government, land transport. Cars are electronically limited to 180. But a lot of people swapped it out for aftermarket, and this is a genuine Nismo 320 speedometer cluster. Very nice touches here. The very simple interior here, coming from 1989 with ideas from the 1990s, but the indent here, usually on older cars, the material gets all soft and it starts puffing up, but this car is in really good condition. And some bits are not stock. On the normal R32 GT-R, the triple meters are a little bit different, and they show front torque, but probably not very important in this car. So he's replaced it with the DEFI temperature gauge and oil pressure gauge, and a 2-DIN navigation system. The gear shift here was very, very nice to shift, and mechanical, nice throws, and the Nissan style of the FRs having the handbrake very, very close to the driver and also very close to the shifter, which makes it very easy to drive. The ergonomics of this are excellent. One small thing about the R32, it doesn't actually have cup holders. There's a little space here, and you've got a little box for items, maybe some cigarettes or CDs, but basically no cup holders. Maybe that wasn't, a thinking in the early 80s that you needed drinks, but later cars put cup holders in as standard. Okay, so now looking at the engine bay, it's a 2.6 liter inline six, codenamed the RB26 DETT. Nissan created this engine specifically for Group A racing, and it's got a lot of parts that were seen as really high-tech and revolutionary back in 1989. But let's have a look at what they are. The stock car has ceramic twin turbos located on the right side, of the engine, very conventional compared to the Toyota Supra, which has it on the opposite side. Direct ignition coils, the iron block with an aluminium head, 4 valves per cylinder, DOHC. But what's really interesting, I want to point out this part. This is a mechanism that operates 6 individual throttle bodies. Yes, one of the only road cars, even compared to a lot of cars these days, clearly made for Group A racing regulations. Individual throttle bodies make airflow more even, coming in from the intercooler and giving higher response. Now, the engine, unlike a lot of 6 cylinders like compared to Toyota, is a short stroke engine, which means it could rev almost 8,000 RPM. So the pistons and the cylinder head design were all for a base to get more higher tuning power. And of course, this was seen in the Nismo Group A car. Of course, that engine has a lot different and more better design internals. One of the advantages of having a short stroke engine with high power, which means that having the higher rev range, you can put more boost, more power onto that, and it's very suited for high-speed runs and also for circuit racing. So in the next part, we're going to have a look at what tuning was done to this car.
Ken told you a little bit more about the background of this car in terms of in motorsport and kind of the stock aspects of this car. I'm going to talk more about the tuning side of things. So looking at it here, we have some really nice T37s on it. These are a pretty classic wheel. I would say there's nobody that dislikes these. I don't know, we might find out in the comments. One more thing that's very special about these wheels, they are forged magnesium. Behind these wheels, you can see these big Brembo F50 calipers. Now, you'll always hear people saying F40 calipers, F50 calipers. What does that all mean? F50 calipers are radial mounted. Radial mounted means, now when you have a traditional style caliper, traditional Brembo caliper, the bolts that hold the caliper in come from the back of the caliper and it bolts to the knuckle. A radial mounted caliper, the bolts come in from the top like this, and what that allows you to do, why that's important, is you can add shims where the caliper mounts and you can space the caliper out more. When you space the caliper out more, you can run a bigger rotor, and that's exactly what he's done here. So this is a 355 millimeter rotor and it's 2-piece as well. It's slotted. Next up obviously would be the tires. So in Japan, this type of tire is called an S tire, and what an S tire is it's basically a semi-slick, and that's their slang for it here. That's what they call it. These Advans as well, they are pretty sticky, and the owner was telling me that he does go through these tires pretty quickly, because I bet their tread wear rating is not so great, but that's not what we're after anyway, right? If you've ever driven on semi-slicks, you'll know once they get a little warmed up, they start kicking up a lot of rocks, and you can really hear it. You can hear the grip, I think. Moving on to the engine side of things, at first glance, right, to be honest, it looks pretty tame. That's because the way that this tune is done, it's more like what you'd see in an old option mag. Nowadays, people tend to run single turbo setups on RBs with modern day twin scroll manifolds and twin wastegate setups. You know, arguably they might spool a little bit better. But this car is running HKS GT2530 twin turbos. They're ball bearing, so they're of the newer sort, and the boost is set at about 1.2 bar. I'm not sure what that is in pounds. I think it's about 16 or 18 pounds of boost. Here, another thing that you can tell has been changed right away. These are definitely not the stock coils here. These are R35 coils, and they require you to redo the harness that's going to them, and they have a special billet mounting plate for them here as well. When you have a turbo car and you turn the boost up, one thing you will fight is spark blowout and problems with ignition. Back in the day, people used to use HKS DLI boxes. It's like a capacitor, a giant capacitor. What happens is it stores the electrical charge and feeds the coils and makes a stronger charge. But with these types of coils, they're more modern, they work better, and a lot of people are switching over to this style nowadays. Other things that we can gather just by looking at it at first glance, here there's a oil filter sandwich adapter. And now what this does, I'm sure a lot of you guys already know, but there's a place where the oil filter mounts on the block. This is a relocation that puts the filter up here, coated with Teflon, I believe. And they come off the oil filter sandwich block over here. You can see the oil pressure, oil temp gauges are all plumbed here. Then the lines run down this way to the oil cooler, which is in the bumper down there. You can't really see it from up here. If we come around this way, probably see it hiding right there. So you can see he's got some mesh netting that's been put over the oil cooler, and I'm assuming that's because he's trying to protect it from rocks that are being kicked up off the front tires. Here's another very interesting piece here. It's this strut bar. Now, this was the first time that I saw this strut bar myself, well, in person at least. And this is made by a company called Auto Select. And you can just see this, it's just massive. And it's just this one solid block. It's really crazy. Even the mounting points here on the strut tower are a lot beefier than some of the other common strut bars you might see, like Cusco. If you look here on the strut tower, even the point where it mounts to the strut tower itself is very beefy. And I thought that's a very unique piece, and it really looks nice in this engine bay. It really sets it off, I think. Moving on to the suspension, since we were on the topic of the strut bar as well, if you look through here, guys, you can see the top hat says HKS, but actually only the top hat is HKS. The actual strut tube is an Öhlins unit, and obviously, you know, Öhlins is a pretty big name in the suspension world. The owner of the car was telling me that it's great for the circuit and it's pretty good on the mountain roads as well, but just for like driving around town, it's really harsh, and he said he'd like to switch it out to something else when possible. When you're shooting for more power, right, and you're putting more air into the motor, the next thing you're going to need is more fuel. So this car has 700cc injectors, and in the tank it has a Bosch 044 pump, which is a pretty standard thing. People have been using those for ages, and it's good for I think the power levels he's going for, which is around 500 horsepower. This, I think, is a very important upgrade for any turbo car, because usually you tend to run a little bit hotter, and on these old Japanese 90s cars, you tend to have like plastic end tanks and stuff, and that stuff over time it deteriorates and it's just waiting to break, and that's just not something you want to deal with if you're just stuck on the highway somewhere. So upgrading to an aluminum radiator like this, I think is definitely something you should do as preventative maintenance. Another thing we can look at here, looking at this catch can, I'm gonna say this might be a Cusco catch can, or it might be a Greddy. I'm gonna lean more towards Cusco on this though. The correct way to plumb this is into the intake piping here for the turbo. So you're actually drawing out that crankcase pressure using the suction from the turbos, and it collects that blow-by oil into this canister right here. Over here, it's hiding on the strut tower, it's bolted, and this right here is the solenoid for the HKS EVC boost controller. This car has an HKS EVC 5, which is a little bit old now, but it still does the job. Another very common upgrade that you can see on a lot of like these older period correct like Japanese builds are these HKS pod filters here. I always thought these looked really cool. They're very eye-catching. These appear to be factory RB26 airflow meters, and nowadays as well you see more people converting this stuff over to map sensor instead. So this is pretty old school, I think, to still be using mass airflow. So another thing I want to touch on, guys, you can't really see it in front of us right now, but it's the computer that's in this car. This car has a HKS FCON V Pro, and nowadays a lot of people use Haltex or Lynx, Pro EFI and things like that. The HKS FCON is still pretty big here in Japan. Obviously it's a Japanese product, and it's not as difficult to find a tuner for an HKS ECU out here, so I think that contributes a lot to why people still use it. And just to give you a basic idea of why this ECU is still pretty relevant here, so overseas nowadays people tend to use E85 when going for high numbers, and E85 is not really a thing here in Japan. And so the HKS ECUs are fine because nobody's trying to run flex fuel or anything like that. The other point to make here as well is the reason why E85 is probably not as big here is I don't think you'd really need it because our pump gas here is 100 octane, well 100 RON, so that's usually more than enough for the power levels that most people are trying to shoot for. Unfortunately, we don't have X-ray vision, so we can't look through the car to show you the diff, but it does have a Nismo two-way in it, and it is pretty aggressive. Just watching the car pull out of the parking spot before, I could tell because you can kind of hear the diff clunking around as the car is moving. Pretty hardcore. Oh, and on the subject of the diff, moving on to the rest of the driveline, the clutch as well is an ORC twin plate, and Ken kind of stalled it before, but I'm pretty sure we're gonna cut that out, right? Muffler section here is HKS. And the car also has an HKS catalyzer in it. So earlier, you guys might have seen a shot of this car pulling out of the parking spot and moving around a little bit. And you might have thought, hey, that's kind of quiet for the level of tune that this car has. But that's because it has that catalyzer in there, and that does quiet it down a lot versus being a full straight pipe. To be honest, I really love the seating position. It's nice and low, and that's thanks to this Recaro full bucket seat and these lower positioned seat rails as well. You can see the car does have harnesses, 4-point harness in here. It has a cage as well with door bars. That's super cool, but to be honest, it makes it a little bit hard to get in and out of this thing. But then again, more style points, right? So you can see the cage here. It goes through the dash, and then it goes across here, across the front windshield as well. And it has like this cushioning like cover on it. And the reason for that is because when you do shaken in Japan, which is their vehicle inspection, you cannot pass with a roll bar that doesn't have this type of cushioning on it. So I was reading on this because I wanted to put one in my Evo. So that's just another side note as well. So guys, this car has a lot of stuff done to it, so I'm gonna try to go over everything that I can. Obviously, I might miss some things, but bear with me here. So if you look over to the right side over here, we have the HKS EVC5 that I was talking about earlier. This is the control unit for it. And one thing in particular that I really like is this boost gauge that he has here. This is an HKS boost gauge. And it might be a little difficult to tell from the video, but that's actually quite a small gauge. Now, the reason why that's special is most of these older JDM gauges, you'll know they come in 52mm and 60mm variants. And this looks even smaller than that. And I always wondered if I was gonna mount a gauge right here on the steering column, it's gonna block the tachometer and the speedo, and I thought that was not really a good look. But this smaller gauge like this is actually really nice. And I'm gonna try to see if I can find one of these for my car as well. On the left, we have a PLX gauge. It's a multi-gauge, so I'm sure you can get a couple different readouts for different parameters there. I know PLX usually makes like wide bands. That's what they're kind of famous for. Some of you have already probably noticed the cluster there. That is a Nismo cluster, 320 km/h cluster. Whether or not he actually does those speeds, well, you know, we're being safe on the street, right? So here we have this Defi DIN gauge here, and I believe this is oil pressure, oil temp, and water temp that he's got here. Very, very cool the way it fits into the dash like that. It's a very clean look. I know there are some Nismo gauges as well that fit in the same location. The rest of the car over in the passenger seat, that's stock. I'm sure that's probably better that way if you're gonna take a passenger along with you. This full bucket might get a little uncomfortable for long car rides. And just look at that. To be honest guys, when I was younger, and well, even now to be honest, I really liked street cars that had cages in them. I know it isn't necessary, but just look at how cool it looks. especially with this crossbar here, when you look at the car from the outside and you see that bar through the window, it just looks cool. It looks like it means business. Here's one more thing as well, the Momo wheel that's in front of me here. Over by the pedals, stock GT-R pedals, but we have an Impel accelerator pedal. I haven't seen that before. Very, very cool. It seems like every time I walk away from this car, I think about something else to talk about, so I'm sorry the video is going to be pretty long. But in the interior of the car, there's one thing I didn't mention that is actually pretty unique. Not unique, it's actually pretty cool. There is a torque split controller. So the Skyline obviously has a Tesla ETS, and a lot of companies make these little control boxes that allow you to adjust how much torque goes to the front and the rear wheels and how it ramps up.
ギア比はGT-R 系は長いから。
Due to sensitive issues, the owner of this car, Ogi-san, is not available to appear on the video. So therefore, I would like to share some of his comments as we talked about during the drive. The R32 GT-R is one of his favorite GT-Rs in the range, even though he does have an R35, which is a lot more powerful even without tuning. The magic of the old chassis with lightweight and wheelbase that's shorter than all of the other generations has something special. This car has been tuned perhaps to his absolute liking in terms of period correct style, with the turbochargers and also the ECU giving 500 horsepower, which is perhaps just nice to run on the streets, on high speed on the highway, and also on the circuit, and also on the tollgate. Many Japanese enthusiasts of his generation admired the Group A racing cars that had over 500 horsepower, and many of them aspired to have the sort of same build. And even today, the R32 is still perhaps more popular than any of the other Skyline GT-R ranges. And being in this car, I kind of understand why. And he explains that even with a lot of tuning on modern cars like the R35 or even the later R34, there's just something particularly unique about the feel. It also goes on to explain how the R32's frameless door windows actually start to open a gap as it's going at higher speeds because the air pressure just sort of forces it a little bit open. This can't be helped at all. There is another reason why Oki-san bought this R32 GT-R with its 500 horsepower and its well-balanced tuning again after 20 long years. But back in the 90s, when the street racing scene and the culture was at its golden age, there was one particular group that stood out among the rest. Right at the top of the tier, they were featured in Option magazine and were the inspiration for various manga and games, and perhaps goes down in the folklore of street racing culture. This group, which we will perhaps cover in more depth in the future, is still around. So after 20 long years, he achieved his dream by making certain efforts and could put on the proud stickers, as you can see here in this video.
So we took a ride in the car.
Yeah.
And what was your feelings?
Well, for starters, right, just the way the torque comes on from the twins is pretty intense, because I'm used to like a single turbo. I used to have a single on my 1J in my A70, and that was more like you'd wait, and then it's just like whap, and then right. And this car is more like a wave of torque, and it just starts a little bit lower, and you can feel it almost carrying the car and making it lighter. You can feel the revs get lighter as the turbos come online. It's
right.
It's a different feeling, the twins.
My feeling compared to a stock R32 GT-R, the stock car is very, very linear.
Yeah.
It gets up to speed, but you don't really feel that punch. So having these twin turbos and with the F-Con, all that tuning, it just multiplies that stock feeling, in my opinion.
Yeah.
With, like, 100 more horsepower and like 20 kilograms of torque. I really think this is how it should have come up from the factory.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I drove a factory 33 GT-R, and like you said, like there is no real like punch when you get on it. This does have a more noticeable kick to it.
Yeah.
And since there's no like actual blow-off valve, it's pretty sick because it just makes this nice noise. Like, so you're just revving and you're like, wah, and you let off and it's like, shoo, doo, 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 doo. It's so sick.
With that noise.
You feel it.
Yeah.
You can hear the air pulsing between both turbos.
Mm-hmm.
It's nuts. I was just sitting there just,
Oh yeah.
sick.
You know,
Yeah.
the whole feeling of the car. Now I was speaking to the owner as we were riding. It's so mechanical. Like
Yeah, yeah.
every transition from the pedal through the drivetrain. I mean, if you compare it to the modern cars like the 35, you just feel every mechanical horsepower going through it. And
Yeah, definitely. Especially because I rode in the 35 this morning, and that was the first time I've ever ridden in a 35. And
Okay.
then riding in the passenger seat of this 32 after that, it's clear like where their strengths are. Like the 35 is fast. Like
Yeah,
there's no
yeah.
way, there's no getting around
I mean,
that. It's
look,
fast. Yeah,
and
yeah.
as he said, you know,
Yeah.
he also has the 35.
Yeah.
With no tuning, it's effortless. You can just go to high speeds.
Yeah.
But you know, going back into
It's quite stable.
It is very stable.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you're doing some serious speeds before you even notice it.
Exactly,
That's the thing.
exactly.
But saying that, this car is no slouch either. It is pretty stable. I mean, it's got like track-oriented suspension. It's got really sticky tires on it. It felt
Yeah.
pretty flat through the corners. That diff alone is like really crazy.
it's
like,
a Nismo GT diff. It's much stronger than
I think
normal
it's a
ones.
two-way or something
It's a
like
two-way.
that. Yeah, yeah.
But it just shakes the whole car when
Yeah.
you're turning. It really feels like a race car, you
When
know.
he's doing the U-turn,
Yeah.
right, you can just hear it just in the back. Yeah. It's sick. Yeah.
The race cars actually feel like that. You know, the roll cage inside. Now, a little point about the roll cage. The stock B&R 32's chassis is actually pretty soft. I mean,
Yeah.
when it came out with the Atessa four-wheel drive system, it really, you know, could make a car that naturally would understeer to turn a lot. But with the
Yeah.
roll cage, just strengthening the body of the base
Yeah.
really makes a big difference. However, compared like even to the later generation, the 34, it still doesn't really match up. But I think the tuning done by the shop for this car really
Yeah.
balances out everything. And it's, you know, we're lucky because we're able to experience a car that would appear in like Option magazine.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Like riding in a car like this, I think gave me a lot more inspiration for my own build, which I want to do.
So you're gonna do it, eh?
I'm gonna do it. Yeah.
Maybe a little Sora.
Yeah, I'm gonna get a Sora,
Something
and
like
I'm gonna
that.
do it up just like this. I'm gonna make a nice street car, I think.
Nice,
And this is a good balance. This is a good benchmark.
See, for me, I'm just gonna build a Spoon EG6 with like a toge and circuit ability. So different schools of thoughts, but still old school JDM.
You know, I gotta hit 30 kilometers per hour on the Wangan, you know.
Yeah. So guys, that was a really exhilarating experience, and we were really lucky. Thanks to the owner. You can check his Instagram, Ogi R35 over here, and follow his episodes, and also his past. He's got a lot of interesting stories, and we'll thank him for the opportunity to experience this car.
Yeah, definitely.
we'll
Taking
be-
time out of his day to come out here. That was really nice of him.
So we will definitely be going forwards and maybe exploring other tuned cars and a similar build. So let us know in the comments what kind of cars, what kind of builds you like to see, and if we can find them. So that's all from us from this episode, and until the next time, peace out.